So Bonnie is also a research fellow at our, she's a Wellcome Trust funded research fellow at the Centre for the History of Emotion. And she specialises in autism. She's worked on a project called Neuroscience, Psychology and Education, Autism in the UK from 1959 to 2014. It's a very critical moment for thinking about autism. She's looked at a range of sources from government archives to schools and governance and so on, to try and understand the relationship between reported levels of autism and how autism has been standardised in neuroscientific and genetic research. Bonnie is currently, Bonnie's book has just come out, The Metamorphosis of Autism, so if you're interested in read more about it there. But just to remind any newcomers also, we are recording the talks this evening. That's only the speaker who will be recorded on video, but if you do ask questions at the end, then we will pick those up with audio, so just bear that in mind if you've got questions. Sorry, and Jules?
If you want to tweet about this talk or other stuff at the event, the hashtag is Am I Normal?
Okay, thanks very much, Bonnie.
So thank you. I'm Bonnie Evans. The title of this, thank you so much for that introduction. That means I don't have to explain myself. This talk is called Autism, Neurodiversity and the Neurotypicals, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail about what these words mean later, neurodiversity and neurotypicals. But neurotypical typically means normal. But let's start off with autism. So no doubt you've come across this word, this idea, this concept before. As you may or may not know, in the last 20 to 25 years, there's been a huge increase in the diagnosis of autism in Britain. Most recent population studies claim that around 1 in every 64 children have autism or autistic spectrum disorder or condition. So that's a huge number, actually. That's around one child in every couple of school classrooms across the UK. So this is a very prevalent issue, and that's why, no doubt, we've all come across the concept before. In 2009, the Autism Act was passed in Britain, and this is one of the most significant acts to be passed, legislation in relation to disability legislation. It's often regarded as the first ever disability-specific legislation to be passed in the UK. And what that means is that it means that those who are diagnosed with the condition of autism have access to certain educational, health and social care services that those who do not have the diagnosis don't have access to. So it's actually very significant also as a legal category, not only as a medical category. If we look at recent figures from the Department of Education, these refer to children in schools who have a statement of educational need or an education, health and care plan. And what we see is that those with autistic spectrum disorder now represent the largest subgroup of children with one of these plans, and these enable them again to access specialist services. So it's very important as well within a legal context and also within an educational context and a medical context. So autism, it's become part of how we think about child development, how we think about normality in child development, how we think about atypicality in child development. These are just a few stories from the news in the last few weeks about autism. And as you can see, they cover, for example, human interest stories. There was a story circulating on social media, an autistic boy left in tears after he has a microphone snatched away from him, and that was reported in the Mirror and the Sun and also across social media. But it's also used in the news to refer to medical and scientific research, the new research, and this is the BBC talking about an idea relating to parenting and autism that's been around for a long time and sort of creating new news around that. So this is something that we think about often. It's often in the news. Now also with the growth of online, just the online services and communities, you're able to diagnose autism in your children and also in yourself online. So this is from the NHS website. You can look up symptoms of autism and see whether or not your children may have those. And as you can see over here, under the little section adults with autism. The diagnosis of autism in adults is a growing phenomenon, and some adults actually self-identify as autism, and that's how they begin to associate with this category. So what you see in relation to this is also a growing kind of subculture within the autism community, and this refers to what's called ASPI, or the Asperges community. This term ASPI refers to those who have perhaps high-functioning autism, and this culture that's developed around this really celebrates the Asperger's category. So ASPI is regarded as a very positive term, and as you can see in some of the merchandise that's developed around this, ASPI normal is overrated. Why would you want to think normally? And this T-shirt, Kiss My Asperges, you should be proud to have differences in your thinking. That's what they argue. So again, along with this, you see the development of the neurodiversity community. And neurodiversity community argues that autism is just part of a much broader spectrum of thinking. They've also established Autistic Pride Day, which takes its cues from the gay pride movement. And you can see the colours of the rainbow, but these are also colours of the autistic spectrum. And again, it's a celebration of difference, of diversity, that why should everybody think normally? And there's a humorous aspect to this that develops as well. The word neurotypical comes to be regarded as somehow a little bit boring. Well, I'm with neurotypical. Who wants to think that typically or that normally? That's actually quite a boring way to think. Let's celebrate this idea of neurodiversity. But this brings us to the question then, what is autism? How do we understand what autism is? And in relation to that, how do we understand this idea of neurotypical and what neurotypical is? So I've recently written this book, which Tiffany mentioned, which is coming out in a couple of months. And this addresses the question of what autism is, not from a biomedical perspective, not from a psychological perspective, but from a historical perspective. So I look back into the history to try and think about how autism has been defined, and in particularly how it's been defined in relation to normal or typical childhood development. So what we see is that the concept of autism, when it's first developed in the early 20th century, it's used, it's developed by this man, Eugen Bleuler. He comes up with the term autism, and he develops it really as a critique or as a challenge to this man here, Sigmund Freud, who you may know, who comes up with the idea that children in the early stages of thought, they have a deep interest. Freud argues they have a deep interest in their own bodies, and in relation to that, they develop thoughts, fantasies, ideas in relation to that body before they engage or grasp the outside world, engage with reality, engage with other social beings. So that was essentially what Freud was arguing, and he developed the concept of autoerotism to describe that early stage of thinking. And as you may know, Freud was very interested in sex. Bleuler was less interested in that, so he took out the erot and made the term autism. It essentially means sort of self-ism, but it's before the development of the self. It's this early stages of thinking. So this is what autism means in the early 20th century. It's very different to our understanding of it now. So there are many child psychologists and others who use the term autism with this meaning. This is Susan Isaacs from Maltinghouse Nursery in the 1920s. And they're interested in thinking about how children develop beyond this initial autistic stage, or what they regard as the initial autistic stage, into later stages where they, engage with their peers, and they look at playing in children, how children play with one another, how they play with other objects, how they engage with their world. But again, autism is sort of prior to that. And it's always a controversial category. So in the 1940s, there's a huge debate between Anna Freud, who's Freud's daughter, and another psychoanalyst, Melanie Klein. They have a huge, huge debate about whether or not you can identify thoughts in children, whether you can explain how a baby is thinking. Do you have the concepts to really explain what a young baby is thinking? And they debate this a lot in the 1940s. But what happens is, in the 1950s, this debate, this discussion about autism in the early stages of thinking, it kind of gets brushed under the carpet a little bit by this man, John Bowlby, because what he argues essentially is that we're not going to know what children are thinking in the early stages of life. We can't impose our ideas onto them. We can't say we think that they're thinking all these wonderful fantasies and thoughts. We don't know. All we know is the relationship that they have with their parents, and he becomes very interested in the mother and child relationship. And this is when you get the idea that if a child develops some way atypically, that therefore it can be regarded as the fault of the mother. So this is Bowlby's theory. It becomes very popular in the 1950s. This is one way of saying that Leo Kanner was not the first person to describe autism. It's often thought that he was the first person to define and categorize this condition, but that wasn't the case. There were a lot of people working on autism from the early 20th century. And it wasn't, and there's a kind of myth that's been created around Kanner and around also Hans Asperger's, that they were able to, critically engage and define this concept of autism in a way that no one ever had done before, that they were able to understand this atypical thinking in a way that no one had done before. But actually that's not the truth. The reason that autism turns into a diagnostic category, the reason that it becomes so important as a category is because of social changes. So this is a picture that I found from a book, which is the last ever book to be published on mental deficiency in 1957. So from around 1913 to the late 1950s, many children who were thought to be ineducable, there's a term ineducable, which means that children are regarded as unable to be educated. A lot of these children were housed in institutions such as these, the mental deficiency institutions, and what ineducable meant was that they didn't have a right to education. So it's often thought that the right to education originates at the end of the 19th century. Well, in fact, that's not true at all. Many children did not have a right to education until 1970, and most of those children were children who were being diagnosed with the autism category by the 1960s. So the autism category becomes extremely important as a diagnosis, because what happens is those who use it are able to argue that this is not they argue that these children don't have intellectual inability. They are able to learn. There's a lot of metaphors that develop around this time around bringing an autistic child out of their shell, and there are lots of techniques that are developed around this time also to enable this. This is from the first ever population-based study of autism, which was conducted in 1966 by a man called Victor Lata. And he says, okay, we know autism is about internal thoughts, but how are we going to how can we capture that? We can't. The only way we can capture it is by looking at behaviors. So he comes up with a list of behaviors, and he says if you look at these behaviors in certain groups of children, then you can say these children have this particular condition, and then these children are therefore educable. So there are things like speech not used for communication, visual avoidance, self-spinning, jumping, flapping, these kind of behaviors. He says this is what autism is, and this is how we can categorize it. This is how we know what autism is. So this enables the development of some of the first schools for autism. These are a couple of those schools that were established in the 1950s, the Sybil Elgar School and Helena Allison School. And the teachers at these schools think about developing ways to engage with children who may display these behaviours, but who nevertheless are regarded as able to learn, which they were not previously regarded as. So, the diagnosis of autism, it enters into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders we heard about in 1980. This is also sometimes referred to as the Psychiatric Bible. So if you get an entry in this, then it means that your condition is regarded as somehow important or real, or and definitely as a way of identifying that condition from the typical or the normal. And this is one of the ways in which the behavioural categories of autism and the symptoms of autism really become established within not only those who are arguing for educational rights for autistic children, but also within the wider psychiatric community. And this model of autism comes to be regarded as an impairment. Now, this is the famous triad of impairments that's defined in DSM in 1987. And it's a British researcher, Lorna Wing, who comes up with this triad. So she argues that you don't only define autism by behaviour, you can actually define it by impairments that you will see in all children with autism. So she says there's an impairment in social communication, impairment in social interaction, and impairment in social imagination. Now, what happens when you get this model of autism as a kind of impairment is the meaning of autism actually really transforms. So if we look back to the early 20th century, when autism is being used to describe early stages of thought, and when it's being used to describe kind of hallucination, imagination, early creative thought, essentially, by the 1980s, it actually means the opposite of that. It means this kind of impairment in thought. And it becomes to be regarded, this triad is incredibly influential across globally in the definition of autism and how it's regarded within the psychiatric community. And this is important in, in defining the category worldwide. So, yeah, it's the impairment model of autism that becomes one of the most popular. It's the impairment model of autism that enables what we see, an increase in the diagnosis of autism. And it's the impairment model of autism which ultimately enables children to gain educational rights. So this is what happens in this transition. Now, what you see is that just as this happens, just as you have this metamorphosis in the meaning of autism, just as you have the categorizations, just as you have the growth in the category, you also see those within the high-functioning autism community beginning to criticize this. And this is the birth of the neurodiversity movement. So the neurodiversity movement, the founder is often regarded as Jim Sinclair, who writes a very powerful description of autism in the early 1990s. And he basically challenges the medical model of autism. He says, we shouldn't regard it as a tragedy if a child develops autism. And he says, his argument, he's an adult who has the diagnosis of autism at this time, but he says, don't mourn for us. And the quote that he says is, grieve if you must for your own lost dreams, but don't mourn for us. We are alive, we are real. And he celebrates this idea of autism. And the neurodiversity community more broadly, they begin to claim historical figures as their own. So they say, what about Andy Warhol? What about Alan Turing? What about Beethoven? All these people, they thought differently. You know, they're part of our community. We celebrate this different kind of thinking. Why do all you people want to think normally? Because, you know, that doesn't make sense. And why have you turned this into a diagnostic category? And that's the challenge that they pose to the psychiatric community. And you see people like Temple Grandin, who's a famous autism advocate, arguing that, you know, skills that she has, has these incredible skills of being able to understand how animals think. She says, you know, nobody else has these skills. This is something that I have because of my autistic traits. Steve Silberman was very interested in the fact that in Silicon Valley you see many of the children of people working in Silicon Valley being diagnosed with autistic spectrum condition. He called it the geek syndrome, and he said actually there are aspects of this that again we should be celebrating. And then other people who received diagnosis of autism, this is Stephen Wiltshire, who received the diagnosis in the 80s, demonstrating their abilities. This is Stephen Wiltshire drawing the New York skyline entirely from memory, which is a skill that I'm sure most of us don't have, and arguing that this is, again, something to be proud of. Now, initially, the psychological community, they don't disregard, they're not really aware of this idea of neurodiversity and neurotypicality, but by the early 2000s, they do begin to accept that actually, okay, we don't necessarily have to regard autism purely as a medical fault or as some kind of biological abnormality. We can regard it within this wider frame of thinking. So Francesca Happe is one of the first people who uses the term neurotypical. And it becomes, you know, quite a popular term now, and now it's used quite often to describe normal thinking. But it develops out of this neurodiversity community, and the neurodiversity community develops out of the categorization and attempts to control and define the autism category. And this is a challenge from someone in the neurodiversity community. Well, if you can define autism according to all these behaviors and symptoms, then define normal. How can you define normal? And in fact, if you think about it, is it possible to define normal? And I wonder if any of you could come up with a definition of normal and a way to measure that psychologically. So just to sum up, the autism category was incredibly important as a means to enable and ensure that certain children, and now also adults, received the rights that they deserve to be educated, to be integrated into society, to be, you know, part of a wider community and not regarded as previously as something different. So it was incredibly important in enabling this to happen, but yet in doing so, it also, you know, created criticism from others who were then given that diagnosis, who began to develop this idea of neurodiversity, which has now gone on to achieve quite, you know, a well-known status. So that's my summary. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I wonder whether anyone has any questions.
I was thinking a lot about autism, and what I found that in the Rain Man film, where it is the main problem is how the people react on autistic people, and the most symptoms the autistic person is the kind of reaction of the hurt they get from outside. So is there any movement to educate people not to hurt?
Not to hurt
people.
or the. Oh yeah, I mean the neurodiversity.
There's great torture which these people suffer. Great torture. Autistic children suffer at school.
Sorry, great torture. That yeah, if this isn't. I mean, and that's the goal of the neurodiversity movement is to ensure that this isn't regarded as something that's somehow abnormal. And I mean, the word normal, actually, I was thinking quite a lot about how to use it here, because you don't you don't use it. You wouldn't use the word normal. Neurotypical is a better way of describing it. But I think within certain communities, yes, sometimes people do regard children who have autism as very different, and obviously that can be very difficult for them, and that's that's part of the argument that Jim Sinclair made. Don't mourn for us. Don't make this into a tragedy. Why do you have to regard this as a tragedy? That this can be something that.
No, it's not my point.
Oh, okay.
My
So
point is that people with autism suffer great harm, and that makes them basically ill.
Yeah.
Oh, so that exacerbates the situation.
No, it makes a different illness. Everybody, every normal people would be treated as an autistic person ill to be treated, get neurotic. So the environment makes autistic people neurotic.
It's similar to the point I think you made earlier on about when you were diagnosed or told that you were not normal, and then that can sort of create additional. You weren't here at that point. Sorry, this was a conversation earlier on. Do you want to say anything to that, or should we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people with this, there's within the educational community, obviously, the fact that the Autism Act is granting rights to people to be able to access services to help them to develop within an educational setting, but also within the wider social context. There are ways of autistic people accessing these services. I mean, that's an important aspect of this history as well. I'm not quite sure I entirely get your point, but yeah.
Perhaps the point was that just that if I'm understanding this right, that children suffer taunts and criticisms by them at school, for example, or even as a result of the diagnosis process, they might develop sort of a whole new set
They
of
strange their behavior and they're very badly punished for it. And
Yeah.
that causes neurosis.
A different illness. That causes neurotic illness.
Yes,
Is that what
and
you're
the
saying?
public should be educated. If someone is strange, then accept it and don't hurt her.
Well, I think that's
Yeah,
exactly what you said.
that is what the Neurodiversity Movement argues, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm interested, excuse me, in all the various kind of cultural responses to neurodiversity. For example, I hear a lot about these days about in alternative cultures where people respond to somebody that's, I suppose we would define as neurodiverse, they're potentially given a higher status in the community. For example, they're considered a shaman. I was just wondering if you had any comments on that, about the way different cultures, or contemporary or perhaps historically as well,
Yeah, I mean,
respond to such conditions. If you can comment.
yeah, I mean, I think that is a really interesting point, and there are there's a work that's developing on that at the moment that is really interesting. I mean, I've done some work recently. I was in Sri Lanka talking to people about the autism diagnosis over there, and what's really interesting is that there are just very huge differences in how we talk about differences within development, and that's very clear. And autism as a category, the fact that it has been so popular and the fact that it has been used so widely in the UK, it means that we think about these things in a way that is very different from many other cultures. I mean, there's also a wider literature, I suppose, around this idea of difference and how it's celebrated in the history of madness. I mean, you're talking about Foucault, and there's a broader literature around that. But it's true that, yes,